Good morning. We'd like to welcome you again to the Gardner Lane Church of Christ. We're broadcasting again from the auditorium of the Gardner Lane Church of Christ, and we hope that we'll be able to be back together very soon. This morning I'd like to talk with you for a few moments on the subject of in the quietness of Gethsemane, finding a place for solitude and reflection. What we see concerning the biblical Gethsemane, if I can get this up on the screen, we see it was a garden on the ascent of the Mount of Olives. We see in different passages, Luke chapter 22 and in verse 39, that Jesus, he proceeded as was his custom to the Mount of Olives. In Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 30, it says, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. This is also found in Mark chapter 14 and in verse 26. We also see that it was across the Kidron Valley. And most notable at this time, it was the Thursday night before Jesus was crucified. We see that it was at evening and that it was a favorite place of Jesus. It says in John chapter 18 and in verse 2 that he often met with his disciples there. In this idea of the biblical Gethsemane, we can only imagine the solitude that Jesus felt when he came there. It was a very peaceful place, evidently, for him. It was a very quiet place. It was a place at this time that Jesus needed to meditate, to reflect, to pray, to commune with God. That night, his quiet was invaded by lights, the clanging of swords, and the marching steps of soldiers. In John chapter 18 and in verse 3, it states, Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers of the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. The Roman cohort is 600 people, so quite a number of people came to receive Jesus that night. But let's talk for a minute about our own Gethsemane. We're encouraged also to find a quiet place to commune with God. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and in the 6th chapter and in verse 1, he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. He talks about that you don't sound a trumpet when you pray to God, or that you don't stand on a street corner when you pray to God. But Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 6 says, but you, when you pray, go into an inner room and close your door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Such a place shuts out the world's noise and clamor. Everything else vying for our attention is absent. And we may share with the experiences of Jesus in our Gethsemane. A couple of points to make here concerning this. One is, in our Gethsemane, there is distress and disappointment. And this was the case during Jesus' time as well. On that Thursday night, before Jesus is crucified the next morning, we see that he is disappointed when the three that he needed at that time, Peter, James, and John, they slept. He told them, couldn't you watch for 1 hour? And then he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We see that Judas chose the enemy. He asked Judas the question, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? We also see that Peter chose the carnal, to where he went and cut off Malchus's ear. And even the disciples, they all fled. In our Gethsemane as well, there is distress and disappointment. There's the painful reminder of man's fickleness many times. We saw this past weekend when we were out for just a few moments. I was taking my wife out just to get a few things. And we passed by a Lowe's and a Home Depot, and there were hundreds of people in the parking lot. After the president and the governor and the mayor and others told them that you need to have social distancing, there you find people that are just shoulder to shoulder. Oh yeah, they would remember during the week, maybe when it was raining, maybe when it was nasty outside, but at the same time, when it became a beautiful day, they forgot all about that and they just went out shopping together, shoulder to shoulder. So sometimes we see man's fickleness. Despite their claims, man does not exhibit faithfulness many times. In Psalm chapter 118 and in verse 8, Psalm 118 and in verse 8, it says, it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. In Hebrews and in chapter 13, he says, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. Also in our Gethsemane, there is a struggle in submission. Jesus, he struggled that night. In Mark, the 14th chapter, Mark chapter 14, and in verse 32 through verse 36, Mark 14, verse 32 through 36, it says, and they came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here until I have prayed. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. Sometimes doing God's will is even more challenging than many times at other times. Even the disciples struggled at different times. We see Peter, that he struggles in Galatians and in chapter 2 and in verse 11 through 13 as he gets caught up in hypocrisy. We see even Barnabas is one that does the same thing and gets caught up in this hypocrisy. In our Gethsemane, there is struggle in submission. There is the consequence for not doing the will of God. In Luke and in chapter 12 and in verse 47, Luke chapter 12 and in verse 47, Luke 12 and in verse 47 it says, in that place who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act according with his will receive many lashes. Or the idea is there's going to be punishment. In Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 53 he said, or do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once at my disposal send more than 12 legions of angels? Yes, in our Gethsemane, we struggle. In our Gethsemane, we will find the strength and the desire to say to Jesus, not my will, but your will be done. In Gethsemane, there was the prayer. Of all places that Jesus could have been that night, with his mother, with his family, with others as well. He could have been pressed upon to do so many more miracles that very night. But Jesus was right where he needed to be. It was a place that brought everything into focus for Jesus that night. In Hebrews and in chapter 12, as here we're dealing with that of Melchizedek, but in chapter 5 of Hebrews, chapter 5 of Hebrews in verse 6, it says, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. But then in verse 7, it talks about Jesus himself. It says, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who is able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. You see, Gethsemane was a place where Jesus found strength. We also see it was a place where he put himself entirely in his Father's hands. In 1 Peter and in chapter 4 and in verse 19, it says, therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. In our Gethsemane, only after Jesus knelt in prayer, he was then able to stand before his enemies. In our Gethsemane, we'll find strength in prayer as well. We can boldly come before the throne of God. In Hebrews chapter 4, and in verses 14 through 16, Hebrews 4, and in verses 14 through 16, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We talked last week about casting all our anxieties upon him to make our requests known to God. And then at the same time, we will gain peace. Where we cast our every care on him, he says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, because he cares for you. All the events of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection are the climax of the Bible story. It's the very centerpiece of man's redemption. Yet these events had their real beginning on Thursday night in Gethsemane's garden, because that's where Jesus went to prepare. Ladies and gentlemen, we know we're in a difficult time right now. But this time, more than any others, we have times of peace, we have times of solitude, we have times that we can bring ourselves before the throne of God in prayer. Are we exercising that? Are we doing that as we pray for our families, as we pray for our church, as we pray for our nation, as we pray for our world? I thank you for listening this morning. We hope you'll tune in again next week. And until next week,